Welcome. My name is Ross Virginia. I'm a faculty member in the Environmental Studies program, and it's my privilege also to direct the Institute of Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth, which is part of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Audrey Giles, professor in the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa, which you can see up here. But she's also our honored guest as the 2018-19 Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Arctic Studies at Dartmouth. Dr. Giles is the third Canadian scholar to hold this chair at Dartmouth. And I want to acknowledge the support of the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Dartmouth for this chair, but especially Dr. Michael Hawes, who is the CEO of Fulbright Canada. Without his support and leadership, we wouldn't have this chair at Dartmouth. He co-funds this project. And he's also a strong supporter of the Fulbright Arctic Initiative, a program that I'm pleased to be part of. So thank you, Fulbright Canada, for supporting this and bringing Audrey to Dartmouth. If you don't know about the Fulbright program, it's the U.S. government's flagship program for international exchange of students and scholars. It was founded in 1946. Since then, 380,000 scholars have moved around the world funded by Fulbright. And I'm also happy to say that Dartmouth College is officially designated as one of the top producers of Fulbright scholars in the U.S. So Dartmouth feeds into this network, and it's a very important one. Professor Giles comes from a very interdisciplinary background. If you look at her work and sort of where she operates from, it's at the intersections of applied anthropology, women and gender studies, sociology, northern studies, a very rich set of disciplines that she brings together to address really important challenges and problems and opportunities for the peoples of the North. She completed her undergraduate work at Queen's University, took her PhD at University of Alberta, but it's really at the University of Ottawa where her career has unfolded and developed through time. My guess is that she's going to talk a little bit about how she ended up in the North, but I know enough that she took a job. She went north as a young person, working at a swimming pool, engaged and learned the culture and the people, fell in love with the North. That happens to all of us. That happened to me. And she's been going back and back again and again to communities where she's become a scholar, working with those communities, and developed many friendships. So the key to success in the North is going north and building those relationships, and that's a key part of her work. She supervises and teaches students in several different areas at the University of Ottawa, among them human kinetics, feminist and gender studies, and population health. Her research sort of falls in, I think, sort of three areas which she describes. One of these is injury prevention and safety in the North. Those who are familiar with small communities in the North know that injuries and deaths in small communities, particularly Aboriginal and Indigenous communities, can carry with that large consequences for those groups of peoples, because often the people engaged in risky behaviors are also elders, people who have special knowledge of culture and transmission of culture. So safety is a major concern for people living and working and operating in the North. Another area is basically health promotion and the role of sport and physical activity in the lives of Aboriginal peoples. And she's done a lot of work on that. And the third area is the one she's going to focus on here today, is looking at interactions between extractive industries and development activities in the North and how those impact on the lives of youth and people, and how sport interacts with this issue and this set of problems. It's a highly original and important area of research, and I think Dr. Giles has really carved out a very special niche and one that's drawing a lot of attention. So we want to welcome you to Dartmouth as our Fulbright Canada Scholar. She's here for another 2 months. She has an office up on the 3rd floor. She's been extremely active in interacting with faculty and students, lab groups. She's all around campus. So if you become interested in her work, please reach out to her. She has a Dartmouth email address, and you can just come to the Dickey Center and they'll direct you to Dr. Giles. So please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Audrey Giles.
Well, thank you so much for the very warm welcome. It's my pleasure to be here at Dartmouth, and I would like to thank Fulbright Canada for its support, and also the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which has funded the research that I'm going to present to you today on the traditional territories of the Abenaki people. Now, research is not done alone, and I work with a dream team of researchers, and I certainly couldn't talk about this work without acknowledging the work that they've done and continue to do. So Dr. Lindsay Hayhurst, who was my first postdoctoral fellow, is now a professor at York University, and she is the co-investigator on this research. We have two fantastic postdoctoral fellows, Rob Millington and Nicolene Van Luke. And then this is actually a small segment of a much bigger study that is a comparison with Australia. And our main collaborator there is Dr. Stephen Rinn at the University of Queensland. And of course, no research would be any good without fantastic students infusing enthusiasm into the work. And we've been lucky to have two graduate students who've been working as RAs for us, Kevin Garden and Julia Frigo, and Amelia Hager did her fourth-year project on this topic. And finally, we're really fortunate to collaborate with Fort McCoy First Nations. They are our Indigenous partner in this research. So in terms of an overview about what I'm going to speak about today, I want to describe what sport for development is and what it looks like both in the international context and the Canadian context, and then discuss the role of the extractives industry and how through its corporate social responsibility initiatives, they've really infiltrated into the sport for development domain. We're going to take a look at how these companies represent their corporate social responsibility and how that contrasts with how community members in Fort McCoy, for instance, understand these contributions to their community. And of course, not surprisingly, there are major tensions at work when you have Indigenous communities and the extractive industry working together, particularly within the realm of sport. And then I'll offer some conclusions. So I wanted to start by framing this talk in two quotes. So the first is from Michel Foucault, who says, "My point is not that everything is bad, but that everything is dangerous, which is not exactly the same as bad." So when we talk about the extractives industry, it's a very polarizing topic with people who feel that it's all good or it's all bad, and certainly it leads to pretty extreme positions. What I want to look at is how we take for granted some things as assumptions, and we see sport as a pretty banal space when really it's quite politically charged. The other quote that I want to use to frame this discussion is from Inuit activist Zibidi Nungak, who says, "We're here to do constructive damage to the status quo." As social scientists, we are often accused of being great at finding problems and not at finding solutions. And while I don't offer solutions per se at the end of this talk, I will offer what I think are some constructive ways forward. So to start, what is sport for development? It goes by a number of names, so sport for development and peace, but in the end, it's basically the same thing, which is projects that use the presumed power of sport as a universal and integrative social practice. So we can see, a lot of hope in these sorts of practices. And internationally, it has been used to promote everything from the distribution of humanitarian aid to the empowerment of young girls and women to stopping domestic abuse to trying to get child soldiers to lay down weapons. So this is a movement that has mostly been positioned within what we would call the developing world. But I do want to note that there is a difference between sport for development and sport development. So sport development would be if I brought in a bunch of soccer balls here and I taught you how to dribble because I was trying to make you better soccer players. Sport for development would be if I brought you all together to try to use the convening power of sport to discuss with you HIV transmissions and then use perhaps a game of soccer and skill development there too to discuss transmission. This is not to say that sport development does not have overlaps with sport for development, because when we talk about sport, people can't talk about sport often as just the skill-based thing. It's that often is assumed to promote things like leadership, teamwork, self-confidence, good body image, all of these things. And so what we find is that even sport development initiatives have an underlying sport for development tone. So there's a lot of intersections there. So I would argue that sport for development is a new word for an old practice. If you look at the Victorian times, we can definitely see the use of sport to develop very specific types of masculinity. We've seen it deployed to try to develop soldiers, for instance. And so it's being used throughout the last several hundred years to instill very specific skills, dispositions in people. But recently, it's really taken on a new role globally. So in 2003, the UN General Assembly had a resolution to state that sport is a means to promote health, education, development, and peace. So all of a sudden, sport became a space that was a legitimate space for development workers to go into. And so we had this influx of people who worked in development going into sport and people who work in sport going into development. In 2005, many of you probably don't know, but it was the International Year of Sport and Physical Education. And this was the year that the UN opened its Office for Sport for Development and Peace. So because of this, we saw a proliferation of NGOs and also donors who were trying to use sport as a tool to achieve just about anything, mostly on the African continent. So I wanted to show you a bit about how one of these organizations depicts its work. So sport for development has, I mentioned, been mostly used in so-called developing countries, but it's also being used increasingly in countries that have marginalized peoples, and this is particularly the case in Canada. And I'll be speaking about mostly the provincial and territorial north. So the provinces are the colored sections down the bottom, and the territories are up the top. And if you look at kind of the middle, that's where sport for development is really being deployed the most. So Canadian sport for development really came to fruition with the domestic transfer objective. So 2005, we'll remember, was the year that the UN opened its Office for Sport for Development. Well, the Canadian government held a roundtable on sport, and they said, well, we should really take a look at how sport for development has been used in the global south and transport it to the global north. And they also said we should get industry, specifically the extractives industry, involved in funding sport for development. Now, Indigenous youth have been the main targets of sport for development in Canada. They are produced as being at risk. And of course, a lot of this stems from a colonial legacy in Canada, where we've seen Indigenous students taken off to residential school, where they've been forcibly removed from their community. We have huge rates of poverty on First Nations reserve. So 81% of communities that are First Nations live under the poverty line, which is 22,000 Canadian dollars. We see very low rates of education completion, high rates of teen pregnancy, high rates of drug use, and low rates of education attainment. Sport has played an important role in the colonization of Indigenous peoples in Canada. My friend and colleague Janice Forsyth is a professor at Western University, and she has noted how sport has been used as a colonial tool, not only through residential schools, but through other programs. So these programs were used to inculcate values of capitalism, competition, leadership into Indigenous youth. So we can't look at sport as being this apolitical venue. Now, we find it really interesting that residential schools and sport for development programs have very similar take very similar rationales. So health, education, and self-improvement of participating Indigenous youth were used to justify residential schools in Canada, which were in operation until 1990. And these are now being used as the justification for sport for development programs. So to me, the colonial, I can't even call them undertones, overtones of these programs are quite stark. So across Canada, we have tons of sport for development initiatives, many of which I worked for as a younger version of myself. Right to Play has moved out of its international role into a domestic role in Canada. The headquarters of this international organization is actually in Toronto, but it has started programming across Canada. Alberta's Future Leaders Program is one that I worked for, so it takes the equivalent of a 20-year-old version of myself, puts university students on reserves and says that you are leaders for communities, teach these kids how to be good leaders through using sport. And then, of course, there are also on-the-land programs, which I have found to be very interesting, where Euro-Canadian organizations are paying for Indigenous kids to go out on the land to basically be re-skilled in on-the-land practices, so practices that they've lost largely as a result of colonization. Now, within Canada, it has received a tremendous amount of support. So this is Finance Minister Bill Morrow, and he, in the 2018 Canadian budget, announced $47.5 million to go towards sport and social development through sport programs in 300 Indigenous communities. So to give you an idea of the relative importance of this announcement, I'd like to note that we should compare this to the $27.5 million over 5 years to fight tuberculosis in Canada's north, which is the same rate as Somalia. Okay, so the government is saying this is clearly important to their agenda versus tuberculosis. And the budget notes that this initiative will scale up Right to Play's successful model that is being developed. So Right to Play, like I mentioned, has been deploying its programs across Canada. It's really interesting to note that before this budget announcement, there's absolutely no consultation with the Aboriginal Sports Circle. The Aboriginal Sports Circle is the Indigenous voice for sport in Canada and has a very tight relationship with the federal government that provides its funding. So it has a legitimate voice at the table, but was not consulted to have this European-based organization go into Indigenous communities. So again, we can see a lot of colonial assumptions at work. Who is best positioned to tell kids how to become leaders? And the assumption is that it's not Indigenous peoples themselves. So this is Right to Play's program, and it's a little trailer that they put together to show people about the Play program.
A lot of our youth, they don't know who to reach up to. They don't think anybody understands. Felt so distant from everybody and alone.
Sabrina passed away July 5th of this year. She was only 18, and she couldn't see the beauty in her own self. If we love ourselves, then it's easier to love other people. All the years I've been working with kids, I never felt so much love as I did from the young people when I was at Sabrina's funeral.
I think that's what community mostly is. Being able to help out your peers in hard times, but also help them celebrate great times. Once Right to Play was in, it kind of gave us more of a foundation on what we need to be doing. I started to definitely see more changes being implemented. I wanted that for my younger sister. A lot of kids are starting to stay out of trouble more and starting to find jobs. Even though they may not really be off that dark path, they're starting to be more positive.
So within this video, we can see that, there's this dark existence on Indigenous reserves until Right to Play shows up. then children have hope. The darkness becomes light. The children feel that the children aren't getting into trouble as much, and they're even finding jobs. And so in this, we can see echoes of the white savior complex, right? The Southern-based organization goes up north and tells these kids what they need in order to lead presumably productive lives. So in this, we really see the neoliberal focus on the individual. Nowhere in there is the chronic underfunding of just about every determinant of health by the Canadian government discussed. Instead, it's up to these kids to live better lives and to apparently make better decisions. So the conditions that have created the need for this program are never actually discussed. And it's interesting that despite the $47.5 million that the Canadian government has recently given to Right to Play, there's very limited evidence of its effectiveness. Now, Right to Play's evaluation of its own program is perhaps not surprisingly quite favorable. However, globally, the evidence is really not there to suggest that sport for development initiatives are actually all that effective. Now, these gaps in terms of opportunities for youth, particularly Indigenous youth, have left a really big opening for the extractives industry to try to fill. So within Canada, the extractives industry is a huge player. So by extractives, I mean mining, oil, and gas. 75% of the world mining companies are headquartered in Canada, which I think some people might find surprising. And Canada is the 5th largest producer of crude oil. So we are a big player. And most of these operations are in the Canadian provincial and territorial north, which are the territorial lands, traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. So for the extractives industry to have access to this land, they need to negotiate it so they have ongoing and current goodwill, because without access, they can't, in this day and age, operate. And so this is known as social license to operate. It's having permission from the community in order to engage in extractives practices. So corporate social responsibility is one of the ways in which they gain social license to operate. So corporate social responsibility is a company's commitment to act in accordance with the well-being of stakeholders, civil society, and the government. Now, some people are deeply skeptical of CSR initiatives and have pointed out that these, are not just feel-good, we want to help everybody, altruistic approaches. And some have even asked if CSR should be known as philanthrocapitalism, which is a term that I think is quite apt in this case. Corporate social responsibility initiatives can be developed in a number of ways. One way is through impact and benefit agreements. So impact and benefit agreements are negotiated between Indigenous communities and extractive organizations, and they are essentially supposed to be a binding agreement. What's interesting about these is that they are totally confidential. The Canadian government has no access to them. Other Indigenous communities have no access to these agreements either. So there's a lot of secrecy around them. You can also have corporate social responsibility that's a series of one-offs. So we're going to sponsor this soccer tournament, we're going to build this arena, but there are some that are more longer term, and those are also known as long-term benefit agreements. So they can take a variety of shapes. Now, some have questioned if these are in fact ethically questionable, particularly because they are secret. And scholars have noted that a lot of these confidential agreements actually contain clauses that absolve Indigenous peoples of the right to protest, of the right to lobby government, to mobilize allies, to contact the media, to reject additional projects, or to take legal action. So these secretive agreements really have a lot of power that circumscribe what Indigenous peoples are able to do, particularly in terms of protests once the extraction is underway. So Thomas Muller has argued that this is in fact redwashing, and he takes this term from greenwashing, which environmentalists have used to critique the extractives industry. And he argues that the extractives industry portray an image of corporate benevolence while at the same time continuing practices that infringe upon Indigenous peoples' traditional territories, cultural practices, and health. And certainly there's a lot of controversy over CSR. Coronado and Fallon found that BHB Billiton and Rio Tinto, who are also big players in Canada, that their CSR reports of what they did in Australia actually had very little to do with what was actually done. So there's a large contrast there. Now, typically when we look at CSR, it has been often tied to environmental offsets, and people are familiar with the term environmental offsets. One of the terms that we've been starting to use is a cultural offset. So using sport as a cultural offset. So you can no longer use your traditional territories to hunt, to trap, to fish, but you're able to do these things instead. So it's basically a form of substitution. Now, sport and corporate social responsibility are basically ubiquitous, and I would argue largely untroubled. People don't tend to blink eyes when we see Diavik Super Soccer, so Diavik Diamond Mine in the Northwest Territories, Canada, sponsoring a soccer tournament. We have ConocoPhillips. I was trying to look for some examples from Alaska too. If you go to their community involvement page, the first thing that comes up is a baseball coach and kids in a stadium that a gymnasium that seems to be funded by ConocoPhillips. And then we also have buildings like the Suncor Community Leisure Center in Fort McMurray, Canada, which is really ground zero for the tar sands, or the Syncrude Sport and Wellness Center. Now, I haven't been at Dartmouth for that long, but I am aware that there was considerable controversy around the naming of the Irving Institute, Irving Center on campus. So it strikes me as interesting that people get up in arms around an educational institution using extractives to label some of its departments or institutes, but when it's attached to a sport or recreation complex, people tend to let it go. And so I really want to say, no, we need to pay attention to this and look at the ways that the extractives industry gets its tentacles into civil society, and particularly in spaces that target young people. So how this has become so normalized within a sport and recreation space. So how do extractives companies represent their sport for development corporate social responsibilities? So for this part of the project, we looked at Twitter feeds, Instagram, Facebook, as well as corporate social responsibility reports. And we found that there were three main ways that these organizations were depicting their sport for development corporate social responsibility. One was that they were leaders of change. The next was partners. And the one that I found to be most interesting and egregious was in terms of reconciliation. So in terms of leaders of change, the first way that we saw them representing themselves was through the big check. Everyone is familiar with the giant check that is given, and really the Indigenous peoples are often seen as passive recipients. There is no recognition that this is actually part of a transaction, right? There is land, access to land, hunting rights, traditional territories that are being negotiated here, but instead it's, oh, here is this check for this soccer league, this stadium. Another is the use of active language. So they really presented themselves as agents of change and the owners of change. So a lot of we language. So an example was, this was on Facebook. So along with other partners, Dominion Diamond was pleased to provide funding for the buildings, which is the recreation complex in Betchoko, Northwest Territories, which will have a positive impact on the community. Now remember how I said earlier that sport for development and sport development are really quite tightly enmeshed. So this isn't just we're giving the community a place for kids to play. Really what we're seeing is we're having a positive impact on the community. And the undertone here too is that Betchoko is a community that is being plagued with social issues, and that this is an investment in the community that's seen as having a positive impact, which is we're going to keep the kids out of trouble, we're going to get them to stay in school. Now, Colin Webster is one of the directors of Indigenous Affairs and Consultations at Gold Corp. And Gold Corp recently gave money to Right to Play. And in a press release from the Government of Ontario about this partnership, they noted, Colin Webster noted, these young people in Right to Play will learn skills such as leadership, empowerment, and experience positive change that will serve them for a lifetime. We're proud to support Aboriginal youth in building sustainable, transferable benefits for them and their communities. So apparently, Indigenous youth need a gold company to tell them about leadership, to teach them how to be, effective leaders. And these experiences don't appear, based on this quote, to be available to them from Indigenous peoples in their own community. So again, we see these extractive industries portraying themselves as leaders of change. And essentially as the solutions to Indigenous communities' struggles rather than a contributing factor, which is something that I find really very interesting. Now, in terms of the extractives industry as partner, they often state their partnership as being quite grand, when in fact it seems to just be a monetary transaction. So they, in the way they depict themselves, they seem to give themselves credit for a lot more than they're actually doing. One of the things that the extractives industry loves to do in the Northwest Territories, where diamond mining is very popular, is to donate a diamond. So here we have, this is from Diavik, Diamond Mines. We proudly donated a diamond to Sport North and the Aboriginal Sports Circle of the Northwest Territories golf event to support kids sport. We're proud to support the Northwest Territories Championships with 3-year funding partnership, #Diamonds, #Northwest Territories. We're proud to support Sport North's Kids Sport upcoming golf tournament. Make sure you sign up, #NWT, #Yellowknife, #Diamonds. So this #Diamonds in relation to sport is rather unique and again, often untroubled. This association that #Diamonds with sport is just how it is in the North is somewhat fascinating. So what is going on here? An extractives industry is taking a diamond out of the North and donating it back to the people who own that land, and is presenting itself as a very generous organization. Again, the way in which a transaction has actually occurred here, that these organizations and communities have given these extractives companies access to the land, is never really discussed. Government support is another way that these companies have been developing their partnerships. So I mentioned Right to Play operating in Canada. So in Northern Ontario, they have a program called Play. And I mentioned that Gold Corp is supporting this program. And Gold Corp had the following to say in this Government of Canada press release. Gold Corp is pleased to support an organization that aligns with the same values as we do. If anyone has read about Gold Corp in the news, you may be surprised to hear that it aligns itself with the values of Right to Play. Gold Corp recently in Guatemala was hit with assertions that it was getting rid of Indigenous people's homes, that it had squashed protests, and that there was major environmental damage done. So the way in which Gold Corp is able to align itself with things that are seen to be inherently good and great, which is the sweaty kid chasing the soccer ball, really serves as a way to disguise some of the work that it is doing. Now, interestingly, the Government of Ontario also invested $1.6 million in Right to Play. So once again, we have a Canadian government that is giving money to a European-based NGO. And by way of contrast, the Ontario government only gave $160,000 to the Aboriginal Sport and Wellness Council of Ontario, which is the group of Indigenous peoples that is meant to represent all Indigenous communities across Canada and address all sport and recreation needs. So once again, where is the money going, to whom, and how are the extractives industry and also Euro-Canadian and European-based organizations depicted as the ones who have the right to do this sort of work? Now, Samantha Nutt, who is a well-known Canadian who's founded War Child Canada, has argued that this is the new humanitarianism, where we have governments, NGOs, and the extractives industry working together in ways that raise quite a few eyebrows. Now, the one that I found most interesting was around reconciliation. So for those of you who don't know, I mentioned that Indian residential schools were operating in Canada from around the 1870s to the 1990s. And these were sites of tremendous abuse, so systematic cultural stripping of children who were taken from their homes, often for a decade at a time, where they weren't allowed to speak to their siblings, speak their traditional languages, go home often, and also were subjected to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So it has been labeled a cultural genocide in Canada. In 2008, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada examined the impact of Indigenous residential schools, and in 2015, 94 calls to action were put forward, and these were meant for Indigenous and non-Indigenous people and organizations to address the legacy of harms from Indian residential schools. And it was meant to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation, so just like other Truth and Reconciliation Commissions we've seen in other countries. Now, in it, there was a section for corporate Canada, and the call to action was for corporations to adopt the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework and to set standards and policies for how they would operate. So you see a lot of organizations that are trying to work towards reconciliation. So universities across Canada are engaged in reconciliation. It was really interesting for me here to try to figure out whose traditional territories Dartmouth was on, that it took a little bit of digging, because any Canadian university, it's on the bottom of people's emails, or there's an official website dedicated to discussing that matter. So my fantastic postdoc, Nicolene Van Luke, was looking at a particular instance that I think you'll agree is fascinating. So the Urban Native Youth Center is an organization that was trying to get going in the downtown east side in Vancouver. So the downtown east side is stigmatized as being the poorest postal code, or zip code for you guys, in Canada. So there's a high Indigenous population there, and it's infamous essentially for poverty and drug use. So there was a desire to build a center that would provide sport and cultural opportunities, and also some housing for street-involved youth. So it needed some land. Now, Petro-Canada, which is a major player in oil and gas in Canada, said, well, we have some land you can have, and we'll donate it for $1.2 million in 2005. Now, for whatever reason, enough funding was not secured and the center wasn't built. And so this gave Suncor, which had in the meantime absorbed Petro-Canada, the ability to redonate the land. And this time they donated it to the city of Vancouver for $9.5 million in 2016. So we can see Vancouver land prices going up considerably. And Suncor had the following to say about this donation of the land to the city of Vancouver, which was meant to work with the Urban Native Youth Center to come to fruition. This unique partnership is a tangible example of reconciliation in action. Working collaboratively and bringing our best ideas to the table will help to find solutions to complex social situations. After all, we're all connected. So this sounds pretty great, right? You've got Suncor giving a piece of land. Now, when Nicolene dug a bit deeper, she did freedom of information requests after freedom of information requests. She transcribed council notes that had never been transcribed. What did she find? This was actually a polluted piece of land that used to be a gas station. It's on unceded Coast Salish territory. It had not been sufficiently remediated to have anything other than commercial use. So what actually happened here was that Suncor donated a piece of unceded territory that was polluted to the city of Vancouver, which now has the responsibility to complete the remediation. So this discourse of reconciliation is really fascinating in how it's being deployed. And we can see, I would argue, that it's deeply problematic. And there was so little opposition from the city of Vancouver to have this donation as well, even though the city of Vancouver has said that it's against, for instance, the Keystone Pipeline and doesn't want that happening there. So we can see some really big tensions going on. So I was interested in knowing what community members had to say about this. Now, Fort McCoy, is north of Fort McMurray, which is basically most famous for being involved in what people would call the tar sands, but has been labeled the Athabasca oil sands. So the Athabasca oil sands are the largest deposit of bitumen in the world. They were found in the 1960s and weren't developed until the 1980s. In the 1980s, companies could just go in and use the land. There was no respect for the fact that this was Treaty 8 territory, and the community really put a halt to it. There was a chief who put up roadblocks, and she said, "We're not doing this anymore. You're going to play by our rules." So since that time, Fort McCoy in particular has become heavily involved in ownership of oil and gas companies and companies that service these larger extractives companies too. The community now has 12 long-term sustainability agreements with oil and gas companies that ensure that they are working towards the outcome that the community wants. And there's also the Fort McCoy Community Enhancement Society. So rather than an extractives industry player saying, "Oh, we're going to sponsor this hockey league, we're going to pay money for this," it's instead really coordinated. They give money, and it's the community that decides where this money goes. Now, Fort McCoy First Nation has $2 billion in holdings. So this is very different than the 81% of Canadian reserves that I mentioned, where the majority of people live below the poverty line of $22,000 a year. So in this community, the median income is $36,000 a year, but that includes everyone 15 years of age and up. For those who are working full-time, the median income is $111,000 a year. So this community is quite different than other reserves in Canada. So Fort McCoy, it's a small community. It's between 700 and 800 people. And the current chief, Jim Boucher, who's been in power for about 20 years, is very much supportive of development and sees it as possible to have Indigenous values exist alongside the extractives company. And so with all of the resources that they've been receiving from their long-term benefit agreements, they have been able to develop a daycare, a wellness center, a youth center, to fly youth to the Moose Lake camp, which is one of the untouched portions of their traditional territories that they still have, so that people can participate in on-the-land programs, a cultural retention program, an elder center, et cetera. So for a community of less than 800 people, these are some pretty outstanding infrastructure. So we conducted community-based research with Fort McCoy First Nation, and we had a memorandum of understanding. And people often depict researchers as having a tremendous amount of power in these community-based research relationships, but I'd like to remind you that Fort McCoy First Nation has $2 billion in holdings. They are savvy business people, they are savvy researchers, and they are well-versed in the principles of OCAP, which apply in Canada in terms of ownership, control, and accessibility of data. So it was a wonderful agreement in a lot of ways because it really laid out everybody's expectations about what would be done, and the research questions that would be asked. So one of my graduate students, Julia, spent 3 months in Fort McCoy where she interviewed tons of local people. As a deliverable for this research, the community wanted a plain language report on what was going on with sport and recreation in the community. They had all of these buildings, but they were empty a lot of the time. So they wanted to understand what they could do to have more people use them, especially because they were feeling quite threatened by an influx of drugs to the community. So we found that there were really 3 camps of people who felt certain ways about the funding of sport for development programs by the extractives industry. So in terms of the 4 camp, one person said, "People are so against industry, I find it ridiculous. If you have the money to make better places for these children to learn and grow, why not?" Another person said, "I think it's great because the oil companies are obviously going to come here anyways to access the oil, and then Fort McCoy just got a piece of it, so I think it was smart." Another person said, "It creates employment for people, but it also creates whatever profit they make. It goes back to the community. So that's how you have all of these great facilities for a community this size." And another person said, "I'm not sure where we would be without industry funding. I think it's a definite asset to be able to offer these programs free of charge so that everyone in the community can attend because there are no barriers. Nobody's left out because of their economic status or anything like that." And a lot of this was said in terms of a comparison to other reserves where there wasn't enough money, so people had to pay to participate in programs, or there were no programs at all. And of course, there are also those who are very much against the oil sands. So one person said, "I've heard people say that it feels like we're selling our souls." And another person said, we're your dirty little secret that you're trying to make amends for. So that's how they saw corporate social responsibility. And there were others who really saw it as much more of a catch-22. And I found some of these quotes to be quite powerful. So one person said, it's like, we are thankful, but on the other hand, they're just killing us too. And then they're killing our land. The communities lost an awful lot of stuff. They lost a lot of cultural stuff. They lost the way of life. They're not on the river, and they used to fish. They had nets in the river. They could feed their dogs or feed their families with the fish. And now they can't take anything out of the Athabasca River. You know, it's a trade-off. What you lost in one way, you've gained in another. One more person said, I'm actually grateful that they're giving back. They're taking so much. There are gates on places that I used to go as a kid. My granny used to take me there, and now I can't take my own kids there. I'm grateful that they're giving back. And finally, another person said, a lot of our community is jaded, because they think we're owed. And yes, in a sense, we are owed. And yes, in a sense, they do pay. So the ways in which community members framed their understanding of corporate social responsibility, funding support for development was, they understood development as almost inevitable. If anyone has gone to this part of Alberta, you'll see that development is everywhere. There's not a place that you can see where it is not developed. And you have, trucks as big as this room. And they saw it as a bit of a necessary evil. If we're going to have all of these opportunities for our kids, the money has to come from somewhere. And there was a sense that they're owed. So if you do this to our community, you better be willing to pay us back. And I think also we can see how these corporate social responsibility initiatives give these extractives industries a form of legitimacy and saying, well, at least they're giving back something, right? It might not be like for like, but this is the cultural offset. We are doing something. And so this really made a big contribution to social license to operate. And they used other reserves as negative comparators. So without the extractives industry, we would be like every other reserve in Canada and living in poverty. So what? I always tell my grad students that you have to have a so what. You've got to tell people why they should care. So the first thing I would say is that sport is a neoliberal tool. It's really focused on the individual, and it's a great way to turn our attention away from some larger systemic issues. It's uncritically accepted as good and as a panacea for social ills. So everything from, Indigenous kids not killing themselves to child soldiers laying down weapons. And I think we can say quite safely that this is an overstatement of sport's power. So the evidence really just doesn't seem to be there. And what my colleagues Jan Wright and Lindsay Hayhurst and I have been discussing is that, if Sport for Development does anything, it seems to prepare kids who participate in it for competitive capitalism. So it prepares them well for life in Euro-Canadian institutions like education, the workforce, etc. But we also have to look at what it doesn't prepare them for. It's not preparing them to live in their communities and to be good Indigenous leaders and to learn their culture. It's removing them from that. And all of this is really embedded in politics of colonialism, the retreat of the welfare state, that enable these conditions to exist on reserves. Without these appalling conditions, there would not be the need for sport for development to be there. And this really legitimizes the role of the extractives industry. If we have a gap and the Canadian government is unwilling to fill it and the extractives industry steps in, it becomes harder and harder to critique them for their practices. So by and large, many state responsibilities have been handed over to the extractives industry, which my postdoc Nicolene would say is frankly terrifying. And the communities are really left with either what is shown as corporate benevolence or nothing. So you can accept the extractives industry and you can have all of these great facilities and not live in abject poverty like so many other Canadian reserves or reserve in Canada, or you can have the alternative, which is nothing. In general, the corporate social responsibility is not indicated as being part of a larger transaction. And this, for me, is one of the most troubling parts, because then it's really framed as being corporate benevolence when that is not, in fact, what it is. And I think one of the other things that really troubles me is the way that the extractives industry is shaping itself as being a group that promotes Indigenous cultural practices. So for instance, funding organizations that take people out on the land and saying that they're playing an important role in revitalizing Indigenous culture, when at the same time, they are also degrading the environments on which Indigenous peoples so tightly rely for their identities. So what are some ways forward? The extractives industry uses communities' corporate social responsibility, the extractives industry could use corporate social responsibility strategically to address the determinants of health. So I have been calling this housing, not hockey. So in the top right-hand corner, this is Zamboni. So all Canadians will know what this is. It grooms the ice at a hockey rink. And of course, this one has been donated by a diamond mine. But what if instead of donating the Zamboni, housing were the focus of its efforts? If you went upstream in terms of the social determinants of health. Because yeah, a hockey rink is going to get people so far, but when you're living in an overcrowded house that the Canadian government has provided that is infested with mold and has 10 people in it, better housing and more housing will likely do far more than a Zamboni. But the problem with this thinking is that it still maintains the space for the extractives industry to operate, right? It still legitimizes their right to function. And so what I think we instead need to do is lobby the Canadian government to address these determinants of health so these gaps don't exist for the extractives industry to operate. And this better gives them the ability to reject offers. And they might not reject offers. They might be pro-extraction, which is totally fine. But right now, the situation that so many find themselves in is this take it or leave it position. And potentially, this could force extractives industries to find legitimization through other means. And if they weren't spending their money on, the social determinants of health, perhaps there are ways that they could focus more on their environmental record or, developing sustainable practices. So some conclusions. I want to return to the quotes that I started with. So Foucault said, I'm not saying that everything is dangerous, is bad, I'm saying it's dangerous. And that's not the same as something being bad. But the next line after that is, if everything is dangerous, then we always have something to do. So my position leads not to apathy, but to hyper and pessimistic activism. And I think that's really where this leaves us today, is that there is a role, I think, for academics, for students to raise attention, to raise these issues and to problematize them and to say, sport is not just this feel-good space, but a space where we're seeing some major political players exercise power. And then in terms of Zebedee Nungak's quote about doing constructive damage to the status quo, I really feel that this hyper and perhaps pessimistic activism is the way that we can do constructive damage to the status quo. Thank you.
That was terrific. Thank you, Audrey. So we have time for some questions or comments. We have a microphone. We're recording this, so just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Great, thank you very much. Is there a place where this is working, whether there's an alternative system that is working well, and a different way that extractive industries are providing resources to communities that may be a model for Canada and other communities to use?
I think the Fort McKay example is really interesting because the extractives industries are not allowed to say, oh, that's shiny, we're going to dump some money there. Instead, they said, no. If you're going to be throwing money around, it's going to be coming through us, and we're going to control that. Having said that, you still see a lot of community opposition to what's going on. A chief and council are elected, though, so they are representatives of the community. So I think there are some people who would say it's working really well there. At the same time, you're not seeing people going to these sport and recreation programs, and there is a large influx of drugs into the community right now. So, I think that's the best model that I have seen, but I'm not sure there's a perfect model out there. Yeah.
So thank you for an excellent talk. I was wondering how expensive these sports programs are compared to, for example, a housing need. Is it cheaper to invest money in these sorts of things? Does that make it more attractive?
I think that's a really important question. So I mentioned that impact and benefit agreements are confidential. So we actually have no idea. Perhaps housing is being funded, right? But because it's confidential, we have no idea. I suspect that in some places, money is probably given to top up the money that the federal government gives for housing, because on reserve, the federal government owns houses. You can't actually get a mortgage on reserve. So if you wanted to build your own house, you're out of luck. So it's hard to say because that's not that obvious. It's way more obvious when you go to Diavik Super Soccer and the kids are wearing the jerseys or getting the banner on it that says Diavik Super Soccer, or you're going to the pool at the Suncor complex.
I was thinking, I don't really have a question here, but I
Sure.
was sort of thinking about like this idea of like alternative funding structures. And it makes me wonder, and that's kind of where my question was trying to go to, like, do we just need to tax these companies more and then have the federal government or like some other entity be in control of those resources in the way that they're then, given to these different communities, as opposed to some of the methods, some of the specific methods that you talked about and kind of the control of these resources, in these lump sums or building these fancy buildings and some of these other approaches that they're doing, versus like just taxing these companies and then having the federal government, who theoretically has the best interest of all members of the country, or the community in mind.
So I think this is where the Canadian political context becomes complicated. The Canadian government is supposed to have nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations groups, and there are over 600 First Nations in Canada. So it's really difficult for it to take that role. Also, given that Indigenous peoples are guaranteed the right to self-determination, I think most would reject them taking this role. So instead, what you're left with is very limited mechanisms when you have confidential agreements, because communities don't even know what the community next door got. So it's really hard to say, what is the structure that can help with this? I cannot, in good conscience, as a person who supports the UN Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People, say that a federal government mechanism is the appropriate one. I also have no trust that the Canadian government will change its funding practices for Indigenous communities. So just by way of example, education in Canada is a provincial or territorial responsibility unless you live on a reserve and you're a First Nations person. Then it's a provincial responsibility. Then it's a federal responsibility. So it's provincial. If you're Indigenous, it's a federal responsibility. And the federal government gives 50% of the funding that a provincial school would get to those schools, right? So, this is not a surprise to the Canadian government. It knows exactly what's going on. And I think, it's not a surprise, and some would say that it's working exactly as it should to keep Indigenous peoples marginalized, and that's the Government of Canada's goal in all of this, which would be a pessimistic approach, but.
Thank you very much for the really interesting presentation. I'm just wondering, what benefits do the corporations get? Do they have like amortization schedules or tax benefits for these different types of things? I mean, are they looking at this as kind of strategic philanthropy in their perspective? And just from a fiscal perspective, how are they writing off these costs and kind of managing these, I'm going to put this in air quotes, investments
Right.
in these communities?
These are largely donations, right? If they are to charities, a lot of them aren't to charities, they're to communities. But it comes back to, I think, social license to operate. They have to obtain and maintain the goodwill of communities in order to access their traditional territories. Because there are communities that have said, no, absolutely not. We're not having the extractives industry where we are. And they have, also dealt with the outcome of that, which is continued poverty in these communities. So the benefit really is that they get access to the land and they make an incredible amount of money.
in the different tax codes, and I don't know how it works in Canada, you can write off donations against your losses, or there's
Yep.
ways that you can rationalize that within your accounting, and I just don't know how that works in the Canadian context or the context of these businesses.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure. And again, because impact and benefit agreements are secret, it's really difficult to know. The more straight up sponsorship is easier to see. But until last year, even that didn't necessarily need to be reported. Now there is a new law around reporting over $100,000, but not if it's a social benefit. So it's all very complicated, but essentially anything that's over $100,000 and is a donation that is guaranteed through a contract with communities needs to be reported, but anything outside of that doesn't. So it's, it makes the accounting really impossible. It's really difficult to trace because of the secrecy, so it's just almost impossible to know.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was really intrigued by the videos that you showed us about Right to Play, primarily because when I first saw them, they seemed very compelling, like great, happy children, grass in the wind, right? And I do wonder, I have maybe an optimistic view, which goes against some of your pessimistic, but that these groups are working with genuine altruism, right? Like some of these groups are not motivated by the economic incentives that the companies have or whatever political complications are driving the government. And so they accept donations from them because they want to survive, but they have genuine intentions to help people, maybe, right? Do they view, like with these Right to Play groups, what's their opinion of these complicated, like is there an awareness of these overtones? Is there like public opinion that is aware of these?
Yeah, so Simon Darnell is someone who's done quite a bit of work on Right to Play, and they are certainly aware of his work. They weren't particularly happy with it, I don't think. I also recently had an editorial in a major Canadian paper about Right to Play getting this money from the federal government and perhaps some of the problems with that. So I think the phrase "the road to hell is paved with good intentions" is a really good one here, right? I think that people setting up Indian residential schools probably thought they were doing what was in the children's best interest too. I think that Canadian federal policy that tried to kill the Indian within the child, again, they thought they were doing a good thing at the time. We see a lot of these organizations operating in ways that are not necessarily culturally relevant, and that their monitoring and evaluation is largely based on the donor's perceptions and goals rather than what actually happens on the ground. So there's a big disconnect there. And I do think that, is sport all bad? No, absolutely not. But is it going to force a child to lay down arms as a child soldier? I'm also not convinced. I kind of want to say, show me the data here, right? So I think it's an overstatement. It's over-promising and under-delivering is what I think that is pretty common in these things, because you make all sorts of promises to get these funders, right? But then in terms of actually showing the outcomes, as I said, the evidence is really mixed. So is it great for giving kids a break in otherwise dismal circumstances? Absolutely. Right? And I think that looking back at the work that I did, I think that's what I did. Did I teach kids to be good leaders and to do all these other things? I'm not convinced. And I think there's actually potentially more harm than good when you take the 20-year-old version of me, stick me on a reserve, and tell the kids there that, well, if they just work hard, they can be a university student like me, where I haven't had to face systemic racism for my entire life and didn't grow up in abject poverty.
So, I guess there's an element here where it seems like you can't win, even if you want to help, right? With all the best intentions, there's always going to be these overtones, especially with the donors motivating your actions. Would you argue that we should entirely abolish these Right to Play organizations and fund ones that are higher upstream with the health issues?
Oh, I think if you want to get at the actual health issues that they say they're getting at, then yeah, probably you need to go upstream, because sending in people to teach kids how to play games in a community where there's not safe drinking water, which is rampant across Canada, and there's overcrowded houses and tons of suicide. Yeah, that's probably not going to do a lot of good. I think more solutions what I would like to see is to have communities consulted about what would go on in their community and have actual control. Not, here's a program, you can have it or not have it, but we could put a program in your community. What would that look like? What would you like? And I think there are attempts to do that, but it takes time and money. Instead of taking a program that worked in Zambia and then taking it to Northern Ontario, where it's prepackaged, we know how to deliver it. It's called heterotransplantation of these programs. It's cost effective, but I would argue does not meet the outcomes. And if you want to build community capacity, you need to take a community-based approach, which many of these organizations don't do.
Hi, thank you
Hey.
for the talk. So I'm seeing vague parallels between this situation and this issue along with like the sports industry and athletes and how they are like
Sure.
kind of like cultivated to only be athletes and like towards the end like the sports industry abandons them sort of like they have no other skills past their athletic ability. So do you think that active and pessimistic activism would be the solution to that issue as well?
I mean, you look at the college sports scene in the US is really different than it is in Canada, right? So being aware of both, I'll try to speak a bit to both. We don't see, I think what I don't want to do is universalize what happens in the US as saying this happens everywhere, right? So I think that we need to situate this problem in a very particular place, right? Which is a place that has a legacy of segregation and is particularly exploitative towards Black male athletes. So I do think that there is absolutely a need for activism, and you have the Colin Kaepernicks of the world saying, Nike ads aside, which I find fascinating in and of itself. We do really need sport leaders like Harry Edwards, for instance, as well, who Colin Kaepernick has worked with. So Harry Edwards is an academic in the Cal State system, saying that, this is an exploitative system, absolutely. And who is benefiting? And one of the studies that I've done in previous years was looking at Alberta's Future Leaders program, which I mentioned. That's the one where they sent us in pairs onto reserves. And we interviewed participants in the program about their long-term benefits. And we also interviewed the youth workers, so that's people like me, who work for the program. The program's been going for 20 years, and we had a really hard time even finding 5 people who the organization was still in touch with, who had been the local Indigenous leaders, right? So there was no kind of long-term plan for these individuals. We had no problem finding the people who had worked for the program, and all of them had gone on to careers in things like education, medicine, law school, and had really credited working for this program as being super beneficial to them. So my question is, who does this program benefit, right? I think in the end, it was way more of a benefit to people like me, who certainly, I worked for that program, now I've done research on that program, than the people who were involved in it. And I think that really parallels, a lot of the sports systems. Who benefits from college football and college basketball, right? It's not necessarily the players who have very, very short careers. So I think that parallel is totally apt.
Thank you for your talk. I'm totally new to this issue, but I learned quite a
Thank
deal
you for coming, Tetsuya.
from your talk. So I'm just curious to know what happened to communities you described, after extraction.
Yes.
I'm just curious, how sustainable do you think the corporate activities you described after extraction?
Yeah, not at all, right? It's the boom and bust legacy. I was looking at old documents about the diamond mines in Canada, and originally they were projected to only be in operation to 2017, 2020. So we know that some of these mines are coming to the end of their lives. And the long-term plan is really not there in a lot of communities. You have a community like Fort McCoy where they have long-term benefit agreements, and they've said, well, no, this life doesn't end when the extraction stops. We're going to have things afterwards. But it's really hard to force companies that magically go bankrupt to remediate their land and also to adhere to the contracts that they've put in place. And we see that all across the Canadian Arctic. where, like, Giant Mine, for instance, is contaminating Yellowknife with arsenic. And there's huge concerns about the permafrost thawing because all of a sudden those, what were thought to be stable deposits of arsenic are getting into the water system, which is, frankly terrifying.
Well, why don't we end here? Just a couple of thoughts. First is that I think you see the power of Fulbright. Audrey's here for a few months, and so this discussion isn't just a one-off in this room, it's spread across the campus. So we thank you for that. Also, jot down our website here. This is just one slice of what a very active, interesting group of young scholars are doing in the North. So sort of explore those topics as well. I know as I travel across the Arctic now, I'll be thinking a little more differently about signs that I see and looking at how playgrounds and schools are organized and labeled. So you've really provided a new insight for me, and that's great. So thank you again. And if you have more questions, why don't you come up front, and let's thank Audrey.